What's going on, guys? Welcome to the Bo Knows podcast. This is episode 3. The show will be on YouTube after this, and then anywhere you listen to your podcasts, whether it be Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, you can listen to this episode there. I want to say thanks again for the first 2 episodes doing really well. Clicks have been great, views have been great. Can't ask for much more than that. But if you haven't, subscribe to the YouTube Botilli, or on Spotify, wherever else. If you can, follow the show, leave a good review. Always looking for 5 stars, but if you leave a 4, 3, 2, or 1, accept that as well. But yeah, drop a review, rating, anything like that helps the channel out a lot. So appreciate your guys' feedback so far. So on this episode, again, gonna try and keep this 30 minutes or less, just because that is the goal of every episode. But main topic today is going to be the college football playoff and the snubbing of FSU. We'll touch on the Eagles and Chiefs losing this past weekend. May touch on the NBA in-season tournament, which I think turns out has been awesome so far. And then obviously going to get to the NFL Week 14 picks of the week, powered by DraftKings. So starting with the college football playoff. So I've been trying to take the bias out of it, right? Because as you guys know, I am a Florida State fan, born and raised, starting with my father and down the line to me. So been following Florida State football my entire life. So but I wanted to take a few days to make this episode after the college football playoff rankings came out, because I definitely was upset. And I didn't want to come out and just say a bunch of BS and not really think about reasonings, and wanted other facts and thoughts and opinions of other people, especially like the committee, to come out before I made my final opinions on it. But to bring everybody up to speed, so Florida State, undefeated, Power 5 ACC champion, and this all boils down to Jordan Travis. He broke our quarterback, Heisman candidate for the majority of the year. Broke his leg on senior night. We were playing a directional Alabama school on senior night. I think Northern Alabama. Broke his leg in the first half, running for a first down. Horrific injury. Video looked awful. Season over. Right. Our backup quarterback, Tate Rodemaker, comes in. We hang, 50 plus on Northern Alabama. Then we move on. So we have 2 games left. We have our final game against Florida, then the ACC championship game against Louisville. So at Florida, beat Florida with Tate. Tate goes down with the concussion. Brock Glenn comes in, finishes the game. Actually, I think Tate came back in the game, finished the game as well, but was ruled out for the ACC championship game against Louisville. So Louisville comes in, they're ranked 14th in the country, and we are on our 3rd string QB, and we end up winning 16-6. So undefeated, regular season, ACC champ, Power 5. So in my mind, I understand that our quarterback, broke his leg, and one of the criteria of the committee is that player coach availability is definitely going to factor in the decision, and the fact that we do not have our star player definitely went into consideration, and ultimately was the cause of us not making the playoffs. So the main criteria for this selection committee was conference championship 1, check. Strength of schedule and head-to-head competition. In terms of strength of schedule, I think we were 55th, which is, whatever. Strength of record, which is more comparable to what teams like ours, what their records would be if they play the same schedule, ranked 3rd, right? Comparative outcomes of common opponents. Didn't really factor that in, or needed to be a factor, but the main thing was other relevant factors, such as unavailability of key players and coaches that may have affected a team's performance during the season, or likely will affect its postseason performance. That is a bylaw, basically, to put in case something like this happens, so they cover their ass and gives them an excuse to put in, Alabama, which is ultimately what happened. So the final college rankings come out: 1 Michigan, 2 Washington, 3 Texas, 4 Alabama. So I'm watching the show, right? The selection show, and Michigan comes up number 1. Totally fine, right? totally fine. Big Ten champ, undefeated as well. Struggled with Iowa, sure, but I think there's more so they were just disinterested in the game and just didn't want to mess it up. Like for Michigan, all you gotta do is not mess it up, and you're in the playoff. And I think that's exactly what they did. Never mind the fact that FSU outgained them, even though um, the committee was so worried about Brock Glenn throwing for 55 yards. Anyway, Washington comes in at number 2. Washington beat Oregon twice. Pac-12 was outstanding this year, arguably the best conference this year in college football. They come in at number 2. Arguably, I could have put them at number 1, in my opinion. And then number 3 comes. And I'm sitting there thinking, and I was saying on Twitter, if you don't follow me on Twitter, it's at Botilli as well, just basically like all my other socials. And I was saying on Twitter the night before that if FSU doesn't come in as a 3 seed, then we're not getting in because they're not going to put Texas, which I thought it was going to be Michigan, Washington, FSU. They're not going to put Florida State. So I thought we would end up being 3, Texas would end up 4. So Texas shows up as number 3, and then I'm like, oh fuck, because now I know basically what time it is at that point. And Texas comes in at number 3, and then I almost shut the program off, honestly, because I was like, there's no point in watching this because I know Alabama's coming after that, because the reason why they put Texas in, or they put Alabama in, they couldn't put Texas in without Alabama. So obviously I'm pissed, right? And Boo Corrigan, sorry, basically came out and said, the committee was a terribly hard decision, blah, 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 all of that. But ultimately, Jordan Travis was the main reason. And they looked at how we played against Florida and how we played against Louisville with our backups, and ultimately just decided that they weren't going to be able to compete for a national championship. Because you got to put in the 4 best teams or whatever. And that's all I heard the past couple days is, they had to put in the 4 best teams, right? Which ultimately they didn't. I mean, taking FSU out of it, right? Georgia lost the SEC championship, right? And they got left out because, conference champions matter, but they would be favored over Michigan, Washington, Texas, and Alabama. They'd be favored over Alabama if they played them again, and they just lost to them. So the 4 best teams argument is a bunch of shit to me, because you didn't put the 4 best teams in the playoff. And throw in Ohio State too. You don't think Ohio State's going to be favored over Washington if they played them right now? They definitely would. So when you talk about 4 best teams, you can't say that. Same with like deserving, right? Because they were like, you can't use deserving for Florida State because that's not what this is. Well, then don't come back and rebuttal it with 4 best teams, because you didn't put the 4 best teams in the playoff. You put 2 of the best teams, which I think is Texas and Alabama, I think is probably in the top 4. I think the 4 best teams in college football right now are Georgia, Texas, Alabama, and Ohio State are the 4 best teams. And only 2 of them got in. So that argument's dead to me. They said that they watched the ACC championship game and they determined, the offense and the team is just not the same, which, it's not the same. But that product that FSU put out against Louisville, Brock Glenn's not playing against, if we got in at 3, Washington, or at 4 against Michigan. Brock Glenn's not playing in that game. Tate Rodemaker is. And yeah, he didn't look the best against Florida in his, first start. He's had limited action this year, right? But he looks good against Northern Alabama, call it what you will. And he would have an entire month of first team reps to get ready for Michigan or Washington, whoever they would play. So the product would definitely be better. If you're at your job, right, and you have 4 weeks, or like you practice anything for 4 weeks, you're obviously going to get better, right? That just organically makes sense. So the same product that was on display during the Louisville game is not going to be the same when you play Michigan or Washington. Never mind the fact, right? They said that they struggled against Florida, right? Florida is a rivalry game. For those who don't know, Florida State, Florida is a rivalry game. One of the top rivalry games, arguably in college football. You have Ohio State, Michigan. You have Auburn, Alabama, and Auburn had Alabama on the ropes. It took a 4th and 31 prayer from Jalen Milroe and just absolute blown coverage by Auburn for Alabama to be in the playoff. They were on the ropes against a 6-6 Auburn team, right? And you can't just move the field goal post back to make your argument make more sense. And that's what the college football committee has done. That's what other people that are arguing against Florida State has done. And they've also completely threw out the fact that the defense for Florida State has stepped up since uh, Jordan Travis got hurt because they had to, right? Florida State's defense has been lights out the entire year. Make no mistake. All year that they've stepped up. They have multiple NFL draft picks on that defense and on their offense as well. And totally just threw all of that out. And ultimately, what the committee said is they didn't like the way that FSU won the games. It doesn't matter that they won 13-0. They just didn't like how they won the games. They don't care about defense, which is crazy because the saying that defense wins championships, but apparently it doesn't even get you into the college football playoff, which is absurd. There's not a single sport that you could name where you can go undefeated and not play for a championship. And they just want to state because, our starting quarterback got hurt. There's many instances where a backup QB or like a backup point guard or whatever can come in and lead a team to a championship. You look at 2018 with Bama, right? Jalen Hurts was much maligned the entire season, and people were clamoring for Tua all season, right? And Nick Saban benched Jalen Hurts at halftime of the championship game, and Tua came in and won them the championship. Now, it helps that you have a bunch of NFL talent around you, but a backup quarterback won the national championship for you. Now, I've gone back and forth about the Cardale Jones example, right? I think it's a good example. But people are saying you can't use the Cardale Jones example because he came in and, you know, helped Ohio State whoop Wisconsin 59-0. Okay. So those people who say that did not watch that game. I was at that game in 2014 when Ohio State beat the shit out of Wisconsin because I'm a Wisconsin fan, right? I was living in Madison at the time. And so I went to the Big Ten championship game with a bunch of friends. And honestly, Cardale Jones, sure, his stat line 12 of 17, 257, 3 touchdowns looks great on paper, right? 4 of his plays were explosive plays of like 35 or more yards. So most of the yards that he actually threw for in that game came from 4 passes, right? Also, if you want to tell the full story, they had 4 rushing touchdowns in that game that had nothing to do with Cardale Jones. They had Ezekiel Elliott, who destroyed everybody in college football, but especially Wisconsin, ran for 220 yards and 2 touchdowns. And then Curtis Samuel ran for 2 touchdowns as well as a wide receiver, right? And Devin Smith was dominant at Ohio State. They had Michael Thomas, they had Curtis Samuel, they had NFL guys all over the place, right? So Cardale Jones didn't have to do really anything. And they were playing against a Wisconsin team that finished 10-3, and they started Joel Stave in that game. Joel Stave went 17 of 43, and he threw 3 picks in that game. Never mind the fact that Ohio State's defense was awesome, as they usually are, but especially awesome that year. Joel Stave threw 3 picks. Joel Stave was benched multiple times that year. They had a safety come in and play quarterback for our team that year at some parts of that year. So Cardale Jones didn't have to do anything. Anybody listening to this show could have played QB for Ohio State and won the game 59-0. So people want to say that like, oh, Cardale Jones beat Wisconsin 59-0. No, he didn't. Tell the full story. Or if you do that, all that does is just tell me that you didn't watch that game. Using Nick Foles as an example too with the Eagles. So Eagles having a great run. Carson Wentz gets hurt. Nick Foles, then everybody counted out the Eagles. Nick Foles then goes and wins the Super Bowl against the Patriots, no less. And no one thought that he could do it. But the fact that Florida State went 13-0, won their conference, show that they could win without their QB, albeit not the same or it's not as flashy. They don't get a chance to even prove or have a say if they could compete against Michigan or Washington, and I think that's just wrong. Another argument that I've heard a ton is blame TCU. This is TCU's fault, right? TCU got boat raced in the national championship game, which they did. However, they also beat Michigan in a playoff game in the semis to make it to the national championship game, right? So the final college playoff rankings last year was one Georgia, 2 Michigan, 3 TCU, 4 Ohio State. And we got to tell the whole story here. TCU is not as good of a team as this Florida State team, right? Top to bottom, QB, backup QB or not, this TCU team is nowhere near what this FSU team is. TCU was an underdog in their conference championship game to Kansas State and lost to Kansas State in their conference championship game and still got in. And then they even beat Michigan when they were a big underdog against Michigan. I want to say the line was like 9.5 or something for that game. And they beat Michigan as almost a 10-point dog, multiple possession dog. So it ultimately, yes, they got boat raced in the finals, like 65-7 or something ridiculous, right? Max Duggan looked like shit, and it is what it is. But that Georgia team, Thanos isn't beating that Georgia team. Okay? Like that team last year, no one was beating that team from Georgia. Nobody. So you can't penalize Florida State for that Georgia, how good that Georgia team was, and how in the end, how average, not average, but how outclassed that TCU team was. Like I'm looking at Georgia's schedule from last year. They had no close games. I'm looking at it again. They had no close games. 55-0, 33-0. They beat Oregon the first game of that year, 49-3. 50-30. The closest game that they remotely had was at Kentucky, 16-6. Fine. Get one. And then Ohio State, right? 42-41. But other than that, they beat the crap out of everybody. So you can't penalize Florida State for that. Ultimately, what happened is that the college football committee needed to tailor their argument or the criteria any way that they could to make it so they couldn't leave the SEC out of it, because that's the cash cow, right? The SEC apparently is, the best conference in football historically every year, right? They're the best conference. They just assume that they're the best conference every year. Never mind the fact that the SEC went under 500 against other Power 5 opponents this year with a record of 7-9. Never mind the fact that the ACC, who their champion, was left out of the college football playoff, was 6-4 against SEC teams this year, including Florida State being 2-0, beating LSU and Florida. Now, people try to discredit that win, saying, it was early in LSU season. If they would have played, blah, 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 later in the season, LSU would have beat FSU, which we'll never know, right? However, they use that. Why did Texas get into the playoff? Because they beat Alabama early in the season, right? So The committee and everybody else just wants to move the field goal post back, farther back, farther back, farther back to help out their own argument, to justify leaving out Florida State. And the committee just showed that they were scared of leaving Alabama out because of the prestige and the reputation. They didn't want to leave out the SEC because the reputation of them being the best conference in college football. And I think ultimately they're scared of Nick Saban and the backlash from Nick Saban and being scared of what he was going to say. They took the easy way out and they took the path of least resistance. They thought about, all right, it came down to um, Texas, Alabama, and Florida State, right? For the final two spots, right? Ultimately, they wanted to put Alabama in. However, you can't put in Alabama without putting Texas in front of them because they beat Alabama, which fair play, right? So it's like, all right, do we piss off Alabama and the SEC, or do we piss off the ACC, which is right now in everyone's mind a lesser conference and going to be even lesser of a conference now that the SEC and the Big Ten are growing next year, and a Florida State fan base that, Florida State hasn't been super relevant since their championship in 2013. So they went with the path of least resistance, and that's all they needed to come out and say. Just say that. Don't beat around the bush of like, we had to take a bunch of things into consideration, the player being out and all of that stuff. So one question that I had, and I put it on Twitter, was that say that Jim Harbaugh, right, he had to miss the last few games of the season, right? That had no bearing on no negative impact on their playoff rankings at all throughout when they release them week to week to week to week, right? Jordan Travis not being there didn't really have an effect on Florida State's playoff rankings week to week to week until the final ones, right? What if Jim Harbaugh, the NCAA came out and said, Jim Harbaugh is out for the bowl season and the playoff as well? Do you leave Michigan out? Probably not. Even though it's player or coach availability, they probably don't leave Michigan out. So again, that verbiage in their committee criteria is just a cover your ass and like a cop out to leave out a team of their choosing so they could keep, Alabama or the SEC in. The decision ultimately was based on reputation. And people are saying, oh, when they expand to 12 teams next year, it's going to be better. And it's not. It's not going to be better because you're going to have 12 teams, right, that make the playoffs. You're going to probably get say that you put in, I mean, there's not even going to be a Power 5 conference next year or like 5 power conferences next year. So you're going to have multiple bids probably set aside for the Big 10, right? Your Ohio States, your Michigans. Think about USC, Oregon coming into the conference. Probably gonna one of those two is probably get a spot, probably Oregon, right? And then you look at the SEC. You're probably gonna get Georgia. You're probably gonna get Alabama. Probably gonna get it LSU, right? So that's half the spots by two conferences, and everyone else is kind of the ACC, Big 12. Oh, and Texas going to the SEC next year. That's probably going to be a spot. So you're basically going to have 7 or 8 spots locked up. And then the 4 it's going to be a crapshoot. And you're going to inevitably piss off somebody, right? Just the thing about having 12 teams is the 12th team, the 11th or 12th team, or, the 2 that get left out after that, it's not a big deal to the committee because that's a team who ultimately is not going to win a championship ever. You're never going to see an 11 seed or a 12 seed win the national championship. You're going to expand to 12 teams to make more schools and fan bases feel good, but ultimately it's still going to be, the top 6, we'll call it 6 teams that actually have a chance of winning the national championship. You didn't put the best 4 teams in this college football playoff. or the 4 most deserving, to be honest. If you put in the most deserving, Florida State's in. If you put the best teams, Georgia's in. And it's simple as that. Alabama winning was the domino that started everything. Alabama beating Georgia really put the writing on the wall from there. I still didn't think that they would put in Alabama over FSU. I thought they would still take Texas, and I thought Alabama beating Georgia uh, just only elevated Texas to reaching the playoff, which it did, but it dropped Florida State out of the playoffs, which I just didn't think that they would do. But committee has no balls apparently. And the last thing that they kind of said was FSU would be an underdog versus all the college football playoff teams, which they would. They would be a hypothetical 6-point underdog to Washington, 12 points to Alabama, 12 and a half to Michigan, 9.5 to Texas. Totally fine. But tell that to Washington, who was a 10-point dog to Oregon just this past weekend. Everyone thought Oregon was going to win, myself included. So hands up, me too, right? Washington didn't care. Just went and beat them again. So why does Florida State not get a chance to remotely prove that? You don't think Florida State, even current state, matches up well against Michigan? Why don't they? JJ McCarthy's been ass. You don't think that our defense would step up and give him hell? Definitely would. Now, you don't think they match up well against Washington? Basically a finesse team. You don't think our secondary and our front seven aren't giving Washington and Michael Penix hell? That's crazy if you don't think that. Now Texas, I think Texas, we don't match up well against Texas, and truthfully, I don't think we match up well against Alabama. But everybody else, definitely. In current state, definitely, and even Alabama. You don't think Jalen Milroe is going to struggle against Florida State's defense? That's crazy. I think Carson Beck is going to struggle against Florida State's defense. I'm not sure that we win that game, but I think definitely going to struggle against that defense. Ultimately, the final thought is, people in general are going to make decisions based on the criteria that will suit what they want to do. The college football committee wanted to keep the SEC in the playoff some way, somehow, and they used Jordan Travis as a fall guy. His tweet made me super sad, saying that I wish I broke my leg earlier, so the committee could see that we're not just one team. No kid should ever have to say that or bear that weight of his injury just ruined 100 of his teammates' dreams of winning a national championship, or at least competing. So that's just unfair to him. But I'm still excited to watch the playoff. I mean, I love college sports. I love college football. So I'm still going to watch it. I hope Florida State plays well against Georgia. I'm not sure what's going to happen, if people are going to sit out or whatnot. But we'll see. Touching on the NFL quick, Eagles losing to the 49ers. Eagles are going to be fine. They played 3 games in 13 days. 49ers had 10 days off. Eagles are going to be fine. Debo's talking crazy. He's right to talk crazy, but that's going to be the NFC Championship game. So we'll just rinse and repeat. We'll see that game later. Chiefs also are going to be fine. No one in the AFC should scare them except for the Bills and the Dolphins. Dolphins are untrustworthy. Bills are a Jekyll and Hyde team. The Chiefs' schedule lightens up after they play the Bills this week. They got New England, Vegas, Cincinnati, and the Chargers coming up, so they're going to be fine. My NFL picks of the week. Last week I was 5-1. So my NFL picks of the week, powered by DraftKings. I have the Texans -5 against the Jets. Who the hell knows what's going on in New York? I don't know if Zach Wilson's starting. They got rid of Tim Boyle. Trevor Siemian I saw on my TV last weekend, so who knows what's going on. I have Denver money line against the Chargers. I don't trust the Chargers. If I'm Justin Herbert, I want to get out of town because none of my receivers can catch or be healthy. And then the Packers are kind of hot right now, so I'm taking the Packers again -6.5 at the Giants. I think they cover the touchdown against the Giants because Tommy DeVito is going to start, but Packers defense are really good. And Jordan Love, it pains me to say, has also been really good. So those are my 3 picks. Texans -5, Denver money line, and Packers -6.5. So those are my picks. Just made it under 30 minutes. So show will be on YouTube and anywhere you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening. I promise I'll get over the Florida State snub, and I will talk to you guys next week. All right, see ya.